Okay, so as I said, I was going to go through the Bodhisattva Vows from the synopsis that I composed, which is basically a summary of Tsongkhapa's text, the Zhongjip Shunglam, the Highway to Enlightenment. So we have the 18 root downfalls, we call them. So it's presented as the downfall. It's presented in the negative way. So it shows if you do this, it's a root downfall. So as I said before, it has to be with the 4 binding factors present. But if it's done so, then one loses the Bodhisattva vow and has to take the vow again. But even if the 4 factors aren't present, then it's still considered quite negative and therefore something that's encouraged to be avoided. Some of you might remember I said in the morning that for the pratimoksha vow, there's no way to break the vow simply with your mind. So as I said, there's certain ones where it can be broken. You can break some of the advice. So for example, we have the vow not to kill. If you hear about a war and think it's wonderful that they killed that person, then you are going against the advice that's given in the context of the vow. So what's for a monk, it's what's called something. It's a fault to be guarded against, but you haven't actually broken the vow. You can't do so simply mentally. We like to debate these things too, of course, as I said, in the monastery. So there could be certain examples. So what if I'm a monk and my student steals something and he brings it to me and he says, "Oh, present this to me. Oh, this is yours now. And I think this is great. Now it's mine." Well, then I've stolen it. So in that sense, I didn't do anything, but it's still considered a physical action, actually, because the action of stealing is a physical action. Whether I physically do it or not is relevant. The point is that it involves something physically happening. So in the context of the Bodhisattva vows, that's not always the case. There are some of them that can be broken simply by having a particular state of mind. And if any of you ever take an interest in the tantric vows, then there's a lot of them like that. This is why they're progressively harder to keep, because you can break them with much more immediately, much more easily. So likewise with the first 4 of the Bodhisattva vows, then they're likened often to the 4 defeats of a monk. So a monk who kills the order should be a monk who engages in sexual intercourse, who steals something, who kills somebody, or who lies about spiritual attainments commits a defeat. So the first 4 Bodhisattva vows, Tsongkhapa compares them to those, except that they're more subtle. They're harder to keep. So the very first Bodhisattva vow, or root downfall, really, we can say it like that, praising oneself or deprecating others. So to say, I'm a great practitioner, or to say, he is a really bad practitioner, simply that. But of course, there has to be a lot of things present. So first of all, we have to have the 4 binding factors present, as I mentioned before, but also that there's a particular motivation that I have to have for saying that. It has to be a motivation of attachment, wishing for material gain, or respect, or service for oneself, or jealousy. This Shantideva adds this point of jealousy. So if I'm saying I'm a great practitioner because I'm really sincere in saying that, and I know that I'm saying it in a particular context what will actually benefit people to know that, then it may not really be a bad thing, although it's generally advised not to do so anyway, because it's very hard to praise yourself without generating pride or having others have a negative impression and think this person is just pompous. But it's not breaking the vow from the root if you're not doing it with that kind of attachment. And then, so there's a lot of details here. I won't go into all detail about all of them, but for the first 4, of course, these are the most important ones. If someone does this with a motivation of arrogance or anger, it is not a root vow. There's actually the 32nd secondary vow. So there's 46 secondary vows, and The 32nd of those is again praising oneself and denigrating others. But in that case, then it's done out of arrogance or anger. So I say he's a really bad practitioner. Sorry to say that for you. And I'm doing that not because I want. So if I'm saying that so that you'll all support me and give me offerings, not him, then that's the first root vow. But if I'm saying that because I'm angry at him and want to feel bad, then that's the 32nd secondary vow. So it's very different in terms of severity. So it's shown that where the most severe is acting out of this kind of attachment. And it shows that this is the first root Bodhisattva vow shows how important this is for a Bodhisattva. It's completely antithetical to the life a Bodhisattva is trying to lead, to try to make oneself the most important, and then they dismiss others and to call them less important or less less valuable. So I think, and then Tsongkhapa compares this so that a monk who engages in sexual intercourse is creating a root defeat. Likewise, out of attachment, a bodhisattva accuses someone else or praises themselves. But then he says, if it's done with a sincere motivation of compassion, without desire or ignorant arrogance, then no downfall is committed. And then there's a lot of details here. For example, the object of speech. So it must be another person who understands the meaning. So again, we can see there's lots of permutations. So if I just scream this out on the mountainside and nobody hears me, then it's probably not helpful. It doesn't go good to go around saying I'm the best in the world. But it's, it doesn't fully break the vow because nobody heard it. Or if I mean to say it, so I say to Marianne, I say, he's really bad and I'm the best, but she didn't hear what I said, then I can't fully break the vow. Somebody has to hear what I'm saying and understand. But Tsongkhapa says as long as they understand the implication, even if the words are unclear, then it still breaks the vow. They don't have to know exactly what you said. And then here's a question that says the object of deprecation must be somebody with qualities. That's our ground for admiration by others. So these, again, we love to debate these kinds of things. So does it mean that if the person really has no qualities, if they're just really as miserable as I claim them to be, is it okay just to go around saying that? I'm not sure, but it seems that the idea is that you're exaggerating, that you're making some kind of exaggeration. So the action is to highlight one's own positive qualities or another's faults within a field where people generate respect for one another. So actually, as I said, this is just a draft, and I have a bunch of questions in here that I sent to someone very senior that I respect. So he's going to get back to me with the answers, hopefully sometime in the next few months, and I'll get more clarity. But like one of the questions here is, does it have to be an exaggeration or a lie? I mentioned those two books this morning, Dakpo Rinpoche and Geshe Zonam Rinpoche's books. And Dakpo Rinpoche actually does imply it has to be a lie or an exaggeration. But I didn't see anything like that in Tsongkhapa's works. That's one of the main things I wanted to check. So I'm not sure. So next we have not giving, this is the second one, not giving Dharma teachings or possessions. So this has to be a motivation of miserliness. So there are other motivations. It's very important what the different motivations could be. Because there's first of all, the second and the 37th of the secondary faults are also related to this, that could come from different motivations. But also they could be a non-fault, depending on the motivation. So if somebody asks me for a Dharma teaching, and I know that I'm doing retreat, and it's more beneficial for me to keep meditating, and I say no for that reason, that's not a fault, if that's really my motivation. It has to be miserliness. It has to be a sense that this person wants teachings, but I feel I don't want to share them because I want to be the only one who knows. I don't want them going around and telling people, because then no one will listen to me anymore. Or possessions, so that somebody asks me for something. So this could be very hard. Is it saying that every time somebody asks you for something, you have to give it to them? Well, it depends on the motivation. If somebody asks me, for some money and it's really sincere, and I have the money and I have no reason why I can't pay them, and they need it for something very important, then it could be that I'm breaking the vow by not giving it. But if it's a context where I know that somebody asks me for some money to buy alcohol and I know they're alcoholic, it's probably better not to give it to them. And I have a positive motivation as opposed to just miserliness. But sometimes in the sutras, we see these extreme things. Like there's a sutra of the past lives of the Buddha, the Jataka tales, some of you might have heard of, where there's a story of the Buddha when he was on the path as a bodhisattva and he was perfecting wisdom. And he was a prince who just gave away everything in his realm. And some people took advantage of this. And they said, we know the prince just gives everything away. So they asked him, can you give me your elephant and this and that, all these other things that were very precious? And he knew that they were just trying to cheat him. But he thought, if I don't give it, it's going to harm my practice of generosity. So he just kept giving everything away. So maybe we have to be careful. We could just how do you say? We could just justify it to ourselves. Well, I'm not miserly, but I know I shouldn't give this. But at the same time, we have to judge the situation. There are definitely times when we don't. It's probably better not to give something to somebody. The objects are other beings who are deprived of teachings or possessions, who have no protection, who make genuine requests for these things and have no other recourse. The action is to deny giving teachings or possessions that one is capable of teaching or giving and is not promised to somebody else when one has been requested in a proper manner. So for this action to be complete, the requester need not necessarily be aware of the vow holder's refusal. Again, it's just a minor point, but somebody asked me for something and I just pretend that like I didn't hear them. They didn't know that I'm refusing, but I was actually intentionally not giving it, something like that. But then we have exceptions include not giving harmful objects like poison or weapons, not giving due to not having time or not having wealth to give, and not teaching because the person's on a suitable vessel. That's another point. Somebody asks me for very advanced teachings, and I know that if I gave them these teachings, they would actually use them to harm themselves or would get the wrong impression, then it's probably better not to give them. So there have to be a lot of exceptions in this case, but at the same time, the point is not to be miserly. And so Kappa says, then a monk who steals something commits a defeat. So like the Bodhisattva, even more extreme, doesn't share something that he has or she has, and that commits a defeat. And so third, we have striking another or not accepting an apology. So the motivation for striking another must be anger. And the motivation for not accepting apology must be holding a grudge. Other motivations for the latter, for not accepting apology, are discussed in relation to the 19th secondary fault. So again, a lot of secondary faults are related to the root downfalls, but are different motivations that aren't as heavy. So the object is another person who has not provoked the vow holder by striking them first. That's important. If somebody strikes you first and you strike them back, that's the 17th secondary fault, where it says that this is in the sutras. The Buddha talks about the 4 practices of a renunciate, which are don't return criticism with criticism, don't return anger with anger, don't return striking with striking, don't return fault finding with fault finding. So in any of those contexts, if you return that, it's a secondary fault. For a monk, it's also a fault, but that's a different thing. This is about bodhisattvas. But if you just initiate it, if you just punch somebody, then that is the third bodhisattva downfall. In the case of not accepting an apology, that person must have done something wrong and made a sincere apology. The action is to cause physical harm or to imprison another person, or to refuse to accept someone's sincere apology in the sense of not heeding their words, not giving up anger toward them. So then Pabonka Rinpoche adds that there is no fault in a teacher striking a student as a punishment if the teacher is motivated by a pure wish to benefit the student. This is something to think about, because in the monastery we see this less these days actually, but it's definitely a strong part of Tibetan culture. I'm sort of, I'm not entirely sure what I think about it, but I also wonder, in some sense, if there can be some justification that they're making for something that is really a cultural thing. It can definitely become taken to the extreme, and it's questionable whether that's the best way to help a student. And anyway, in American culture, I remember when I was in high school, Milton Academy, some of you might know, to south of Boston, and so when we were, it was 1998, I was there with the 200th anniversary of the school. So one of the teachers wanted to give us some idea of what it used to be like in Milton. So they took a document from some 150 years ago or something, and it was the number of lashes that you receive for different punishments. So, for example, Milton used to have the girls and the boys on different sides of the road. So that the penalty for talking to a girl over the street was 6 lashes or whatever. But I think in a lot of ways we have found other ways to punish people that are more effective. Just hitting people may not really cause them to think about their behavior. Whereas if you appeal to their own integrity, which is the approach that was very strongly emphasized when I was in high school, that is much stronger. I can attest to that, having been there and having come out of that education, and seeing my Tibetan classmates who, when they know they're not going to get whipped, sometimes they can bend the rules a bit. But when there's a sense of integrity that this is not something I personally feel I would want to be the kind of person to do that, if you build that in somebody, it can be much stronger. So I wonder. But in any case, he's pointing out that there is there are exceptions to this. So hitting somebody in itself is not necessarily breaking the vow. Now, of course, for example, if you're hitting one person to save another person, that could be one example. So the motivation here really has to be anger, and it has to be sort of not proportionate to what's going on, that you just lose control of yourself and hit somebody. And then, likewise, not accepting an apology. So then Tsongkhapa, again, he compares this, and the third defeat of a monastic is to kill somebody. So with a bodhisattva, it's much more difficult to keep. You don't just not kill somebody, you don't even strike them. And then fourthly, the rejecting the Mahayana or adhering to counterfeit teachings. So the motivation is ignorance. Although I have a note here that I wasn't sure, so I've asked somebody about that. So either by one's own volition or under the influence of others. So what does this mean? It says, the object of rejection is the general corpus of Mahayana sutras and commentaries, and not just a particular teaching. So this would say that the whole Mahayana is worthless, as opposed to say that this particular sutra I don't accept. That was again related to the secondary vows, to reject particular teachings. But to say that I don't accept the Mahayana, which again is sort of axiomatic. If one is trying to practice the Bodhisattva path and then say I don't accept the teachings on Bodhisattvas, it doesn't make much sense. But it's something that even this morning when I was talking, it was this morning I think, or maybe last session, the question of, well, can we then question, did the Buddha really teach these? That is a big question, because if it's, if I find evidence that it hasn't happened, should I just ignore it and say that I don't believe it? I don't think that's the approach that should be taken. I don't think that's the approach that's recommended in the sutras themselves. But it's a matter of being very respectful and recognizing that it's not so obvious, because there certainly were early Buddhist scholars in the West who rejected the Mahayana and rejected Tibetan Buddhism without really understanding it. And there are still some people who do that today, but it's not as common because there's much more material available. But it's to really examine it and think about it. We shouldn't just blanketly reject anything, really. It should just come from really seeing clearly what it's talking about, as opposed to just dismissing it based on personal bias or partial understanding of something. And that seems to be what's talked about here. And as I said this in the last session, that to say that a particular teaching was not historically taught at a particular time is very different from saying it's worthless, which is more of the point here, to say that this is not something that we should practice or that we should take seriously or hold as an object of veneration. So the object of adherence, so it's again, we had the reject the Mahayana or adhere to counterfeit teachings. Are doctrines conforming with the dark teachings? That I've in quotation. This is what Tsongkhapa calls it. Teachings that appear to present a spiritual path, but actually lead to an increase in afflictions. So really, there's a twofold aspect here. It's like somebody is a Mahayanist. What they say, well, if you really want to get enlightened, all those Mahayana practices, they're not helpful. There's this other, this other spiritual path that I found that somebody taught me, and this is the way to do it. But if you really examine, this actually just is increasing people's afflictions. So we can see something like that could happen. So the action is to repudiate, verbally or in writing, the Mahayana teachings, or propagate, teach, and take joy in a counterfeit teaching, one that does not accord with the Buddhist teachings. So regarding the latter, Tsongkhapa clarifies it is not merely enjoying reading a non-Buddhist teaching, but actively trying to accomplish it and inciting others to do so. Otherwise, then there's a relation with the 30th secondary fault. So Pabongka Rinpoche also in his commentary, he says that it's also, to say that it's not necessary to meditate on all the aspects of the path in order to achieve enlightenment. All you need to do is, for example, meditate on the winds and drops, meaning meditate on the subtle energies of your body. So to reject the main part of the teaching and just focus on one little piece of it and say that this is how you become enlightened, just through this practice. That's definitely something I've seen people saying. We have to be careful of that. Yeah. So again, Tsongkhapa says that this is like to proclaim the fourth defeat of a monk is to claim to have realizations that you don't have. So here, likewise, the Bodhisattva commits a defeat by not sharing the understanding that he or she does have, denigrating the Dharma and giving false teachings. Okay, so those are the first four. They're generally considered progressively, the first four are the most serious. And so they're progressively lighter, we could say, although of course they're still heavy. All of them could constitute root downfalls. So the fifth one is stealing possessions of the 3 jewels. So that, for example, somebody makes an offering on an altar here and you steal it. So that is, the fifth one. Well, I said these ones come from Shantideva's text. The first 4 came from Asanga's texts. But all of them should be eventually traceable back to certain sutras, but they're sort of put together in different ways. So again, the motivation has to be an affliction of some kind, that someone has an affliction of mind, which really means that they're not judging the situation properly. They're exaggerating the qualities of something. So if you're doing it says, by compassion, for the benefit of others, even though it could be a defeat for a monastic, it is not a root bodhisattva downfall. So that is the difference here, that something could actually, for the monastic vows or the pratimoksha vows, they're much more rigid. That doesn't matter what your motivation is. If you steal something, you stole something. But if you're a bodhisattva, you're practicing the bodhisattva path, if you're doing it purely out of compassion, and if you're doing it in a way that is going to benefit others, then it might not constitute a root downfall here. Likewise, as we'll see, even with killing. If you kill somebody and you're a monk, it doesn't matter what your motivation was, you lose your vow. But if you're a bodhisattva, it depends on the motivation. It depends what the situation was, the context. Then there's just a discussion here of what is the possession of the 3 jewels. So like things that are offered to the actual Buddha, things that are offered on the altar, possession of the Dharma, for example, money for printing books. Or like the things that, like the wrapping on the books and so forth. Possession of the Sangha, so things that an Arya being possesses, or something that monks and nuns possess, similar. And then we have 6, repudiating teachings of any of the 3 vehicles. So first we had repudiating the thing in the Mahayana, but here we also have repudiating non-Mahayana teachings, saying that, for example, the Theravada teachings are useless and that someone should just practice Mahayana. This is just as dangerous because we need this as a foundation. It's not that when somebody practices Mahayana, and you therefore no longer take seriously the other teachings of the Buddha. We say 3 vehicles, it's talking about, it's a different way of dividing it. Because before we had the Hinayana small vehicle and the Mahayana great vehicle, or we can just talk about the hearer vehicle, the solitary realizer vehicle, and the Bodhisattva vehicle. So there's just a further subdivision of the Hinayana, the hearers, which are the ones that learn directly from the Buddha, and the solitary realizers, which are beings that exist in a place where there is no teacher in the world, but they gain realization on their own. But these are all have their own corpus of teachings or ways of things that they meditate on. But to negate any of those or to repudiate them, say that they're not useful for attaining liberation. So then we have disrobing monastics. This is a bit of a complicated one. The motivation is the wish to inflict harm. So there's 2 ways that it could be interpreted, and Tsongkhapa says either of them is understood in this case. Could be the vow. So literally stealing a monk's robes, disrobing them in the sense that you steal the robes. But also that if, for example, I'm a senior monk and there's a junior monk who is really sincerely trying to practice, and I get angry and I say, you can't be a monk, you're terrible, you have no idea what you're doing, you should go home and be a layperson again, and causing them to give back their vows. Not because I may be saying that sincerely, and that's a very different situation. But if I'm saying that out of anger or jealousy or something like that, then that's very different. And then Tsongkhapa says that in some texts or some commentaries, it talks about like imprisoning a monk or killing a monk. But he says that should actually be included in the 3rd root downfall, so it's more serious. So it doesn't have to be included here. This is just causing them to give that back their monastic vows. So then we have the 8th one, which I've always found kind of surprising here, which is the committing any of the 5 actions of immediate retribution, which means killing one's mother, killing one's father, killing an arhat, causing a schism in the monastic community, or wounding the Buddha maliciously. So this one I just find, obviously these are negative actions, but it seems sort of, compared to we're talking about striking others as the 3rd vow, and the 8th vow is killing one's parents. It doesn't seem to be less serious. But for whatever reason, that this is how it was codified, and this is what gets in there. So then we have 9th one, which is much harder, adhering to wrong views, as I mentioned earlier. So this essentially is denying reincarnation and karma, or denying the existence of the 3 jewels, or the enlightened beings. So as I said earlier, it's very important to recognize this isn't just saying you have to be dogmatic and never question these things. Again, in the Bodhisattva teaching, it's very clear that you should question things. It's a matter of how you approach it, that if you come to the firm decision there is no reincarnation, there's no such thing as enlightenment, well, then really it doesn't make much sense to have the Bodhisattva vow, I'm going to achieve enlightenment. So it makes sense that thereby you would lose your vow. And as I said, with this vow and the 18th one about giving a bodhicitta, you don't have to have the 4 binding factors present. Although it's hard to see how you could really have this without having them present. If you could think, there's no enlightenment, but it's not a good thing for me to think that. Well, if you really thought that, you probably wouldn't think it. It's sort of odd to say it that way. But this is one example of where we can lose the vow simply by the way we think, as opposed to with the pratimoksha vow. But really, as I want to emphasize that, as I wrote here in the synopsis, about the importance of using doubt to gain a deeper understanding, because this can easily be misunderstood to be saying that you have to believe this. And this is why in the monastery we debate for years and years. And something I discovered this year, which I thought was very interesting, is that in Sanskrit there are 2 different words that are translated as doubt. In Tibetan, we only have one word, actually, tetsom. It translates two different things in Sanskrit. And one of those is the mental affliction of doubt, one of the 6 root mental afflictions, which is a sense of sort of cynicism about something, saying that I don't take this seriously. I think this is probably wrong. Whereas the other kind of doubt is considered something positive, that this is a way towards understanding, that we really question something in order to understand it better. And in Tibetan, we use the word tetsom for both of those without really, I never really heard it being distinguished as, we understand that they're two different things, but I never heard anyone say that these are two different words. But I discovered that in Sanskrit, it is actually two different words that are being translated. And so when we go to debate every day, it's considered a positive thing. Did you get any doubts today? You should have more doubts. There's a saying in the monasteries that when somebody comes to the monastery, they lose their faith, which has to do with the Tibetans who grow up as Buddhists. They have just a natural faith, in the same way that you might see people in this country who grow up, believing in Christianity or some other religion because their parents did and they like going to church. But as you get older, you start to question that. And that definitely happens in the Tibetan monastery, that people lose that. They start questioning it and being much more difficult for them to accept something. You see this with really serious monks who become more senior. It's very hard to convince them of anything. They'll always ask very pointed questions about it, which is a sign of this positive kind of doubt. It's not dismissive, but it's not just willing to accept something just because it sounds nice or because the person said so. And so likewise with karma, we're questioning it all the time when we debate. So it's very hard to see if how that should be considered a negative thing. It's more, there's just complete rejection of it or just coming to a firm decision. I don't believe in this. The next we have destroying cities, towns, and so forth. So the motivation can be any affliction coupled with an intention to destroy property, rather than to steal or physically harm beings. This is different, right? In the third vow, we had about physically harming others. So here it's destroying property. So like burning somebody's house down or, whatever, vandalizing something. Or it also talks about in war, if somebody is a king, because it often talks about, nowadays we don't have that many kings, but in these ancient times, that was the most powerful political person. So if somebody is the ruler of a nation, because in the Bodhisattva teachings, it often says that these are the people that really should take the Bodhisattva vow. It's not just for monks and nuns, it's for people who will have a lot of influence in the world. But if somebody takes the Bodhisattva vow when they're a ruler, then they shouldn't just go around destroying human habitation. Again, it depends on the motivation. So this is the action. Yeah, the motivation can be any affliction coupled with an intention. So it has to be afflicted motivation. But that's pretty broad. It would be pretty hard for, I think, a political leader to drop bombs in a foreign country purely out of compassion. Maybe it happens, but generally speaking, it's that's going against the vow here. The action is to physically destroy the habitation. So then we have the 11th, teaching emptiness to an untrained vessel, which means that you teach emptiness to somebody who's not ready to learn about it. This is because that can really cause somebody to get the wrong impression. And I haven't talked about emptiness at all today. It's a totally different subject. But it's understood that emptiness is a very profound teaching that can free us from wrong views, but it can very easily be misconstrued as a kind of nihilism, where it's saying that nothing matters, there's no right or wrong. And so the motivation here has to be the intention to teach some emptiness to somebody who is not a suitable vessel. So you have to know what you're doing. You have to think that I know this person is not suitable, but I'm going to teach them anyway. If the vow holder carefully analyzes the student to be taught and mistakenly considers them to be a suitable vessel, the action is not complete. But I have a question here. Again, I've asked the senior person about this. What if you don't know one way or the other? That's very difficult. So for example, if I'm giving a public teaching on emptiness, I don't know what level they're at. So we have to be very careful. Chandrakirti, he says that there's two main ways that we can wrongly understand emptiness. Because Nagarjuna, who's the Tukandakiti's commentary on Nagarjuna, he says, we'd have this in English, what is it? By wrongly holding emptiness, the feeble-minded wreck themselves. Like wrongly handling poisoning, like wrongly handling deadly snakes, or wrongly casting magic spells. So he's saying that people who aren't ready for the teaching, if they approach it in the wrong way, then it's like a snake or a spell that you handle it wrongly, and you're going to hurt yourself. So Chandrakirti says there's two ways that this can be done. One is that, like I said before, somebody hears about emptiness and they think that it's nihilism. They think, therefore, I can do whatever I want. It doesn't matter. And the second is if they hear about emptiness and they say that this is a ridiculous teaching and the Buddha was wrong, and they reject what the Buddha said, or they say that this isn't the Buddha's teaching and this must be something somebody made up because it's just ridiculous. So in that case, they're creating very heavy negative karma of rejecting what's actually a profound teaching. We have to be very careful, who we teach this to. And also it says that to fully break the vow, the object has to be somebody who has intentionally cultivated bodhicitta. So it's not just anybody, but it's somebody who's trying to practice the Bodhisattva path, but they're not ready to hear about emptiness. And therefore you teach them about emptiness and they fall off the Bodhisattva path. So then we have turning somebody away from full enlightenment. So the object is a person who has intentionally cultivated bodhicitta and taken bodhisattva vows. So again, it doesn't mean they have to have uncontrived bodhicitta, but they're intentionally trying to practice this. So you say to such a person that, I don't think you're really ready for this. I don't think you'd be a good vessel for this. It would be better if you practice Hinayana. And then they get discouraged and they stop practicing it. And then 13, we have repudiating the pratimoksha. So this is what we talked about this morning, the vows of individual liberation. So it's a particular person who's holding any one of the 8 classes of pratimoksha vows, so like monastic or lay vows. It's, so to explain to such a person wrongly that if you take the bodhisattva vow, you don't need to worry about your pratimoksha vows anymore. They're not important. And just focus on your bodhisattva vows. And it's saying that in order to attain enlightenment, you don't need pratimoksha vows. And so you just need to practice the bodhisattva vow. Now, we had this question earlier. It is indeed possible to attain enlightenment without pratimoksha vow. We talked about like non-humans, then can't have the pratimoksha vow anyway. But it's to give the person the impression that this is not supportive, that this is actually a hindrance. You should just focus on your bodhisattva vows, which is more important. So if the person gives up their vows as a result, then it's a root downfall. If not, then it's the 27th secondary fault. So again, that comes later. Then we have deprecating the Hinayana, which is similar. So it's to criticize or to deprecate the hero or solitary realizer path and claim that engaging them is insufficient to purify affliction. That's the main point. So to say that if you practice what's taught in the Pali Canon, then you can't be free of samsara. This is incorrect. You can't achieve full enlightenment, but it's wrong to say you can't be free of afflictions. And so to have that view and to express it, then that breaks his vow. So it's distinguished here. If any of you remember, probably not, but in the 6th vow, we had, we're going through a lot now. In the 6th vow, we had to repudiate the teaching in the sense that, repudiating the pratimoksha. Well, you say that the Buddha didn't teach this. So that's the 6th vow. Here, it's not saying that the Buddha didn't teach it, but it's saying that it's insufficient for attaining liberation. That really you need the Mahayana teachings if you want to even achieve liberation. So then we have 15, falsely claiming to have realized the profound, which is emptiness. So the motivation is any affliction other than attachment and jealousy. Because if you remember earlier in the 1st vow, that would have already broken the 1st root vow. If you claim, I've realized emptiness when you haven't, out of attachment, because you want people to make offerings to you, then that's the first vow. But if it's a motivation other than attachment or jealousy, but you claim to have realized emptiness, then it's breaking this vow. So it says there's a specific way it's done. It's not simply saying, I've realized emptiness. That would most likely be done under the first vow. It's very unlikely somebody would be talking that way out of anger. It's more something done out of attachment. But it's to instruct somebody to meditate on emptiness under the false pretense that you yourself have realized it. So it's to kind of put on an air of having done so intentionally and try to show others that you understand this and you have a realization of this. The next we have accepting possessions stolen from the 3 jewels. So this is the motivation and object are the same as in the 5th root downfall, which was stealing from the 3 jewels. But here it's, I don't steal it myself, but somebody else steals it, and I know they stole it, and I accept what they give me. There's a few fine points here, but I don't want to get into them. It might be too confusing. But there's one difference here. It says it's to accept something that somebody else stole, or to maliciously initiate a lawsuit that results in those being appropriated from the monastery or something like that, and then getting them that way. So thereby obtaining it without stealing it directly, but doing it in a way that you gain possession of them. So next we have establishing, this is 17th, establishing bad policies or stealing from a meditator. So this is for bad policies, the desire is to harm. For stealing, it is anger. So for the object is a fully ordained monastic or their possessions. So in the case of bad policies, it's like if as monks engage in Dharma activities, it's establish a policy that encourages monks to neglect their attention to come abiding or special insight, and thereby to increase in their afflictions. So basically, it's if I have the ability, either as the abbot of the monastery or as the ruler of a country, to affect what actions the monks spend their time doing, and I establish policies that discourage them from meditating and from decreasing their affliction, because that's what monks should be doing. So if I establish policies that just give monks lots and lots of work and say they should be more productive and not be doing all this time meditating, or to steal an object, which is that in monks who are sincerely meditating, or nuns who are sincerely meditating, to take possessions from them and give it to the monks and nuns who are not meditating or are just doing less important activities. Then finally we have 18, giving up aspiring bodhicitta. It's pretty straightforward. It's set to decide, I'm not going to achieve enlightenment. And obviously, if you do that, then it makes sense that you would lose the Bodhisattva vow. And as I said before, but I'll repeat, we have the 4 binding factors. The not giving up the wish to engage in the action again, acting without shame or embarrassment. So shame means a sense of in relation to one's own conscience. So it's sort of similar to what I talked about integrity. The sense that I don't want to be the kind of person who does this. I feel a sense of I'm better than this. I'm not the kind of person who does this kind of action. And embarrassment is sort of what we sometimes call decency. The sense that I wouldn't want to do this and be a decent person. People are going to look badly on me. So without that, there's being completely free of any kind of sense of shame of what you're doing, or consideration for oneself or others. And then taking joy and delight in the action is the 3rd one. And then not considering the action as negative, not seeing it as a bad thing to do. So, as I said, there's different permutations about how this could work. So if all 4 factors are present, then that's a major fall. That's what it's called. That's a complete downfall. If the 4th factor, which is not seeing it as negative, is present, along with 1 or 2 of the others, it's a medium fall. And then if if the first three are present without the fourth, so if you see it as negative, but you have the other three, it's only a minor fall, because the fourth one is really the strongest. If you have to see the action as negative, and if you don't have that, then it's if you don't have the seeing it as negative, then it can be medium or heavy, major. So if it has a major fall, that's a complete downfall, and you must retake the Bodhisattva vows. It's a medium fall, then the practitioner should confess such a transgression in the presence of 3 or more people who have Bodhisattva vows. And then if it's a minor fall, you can confess just 1 person. So we have a lot more here about different ways that one could lose the Bodhisattva vow. Yeah, so the committing a root downfall is not the only way to lose the vows. One could be to generate an intention to achieve solitary liberation. So that's fairly similar to losing the 18th vow, giving up bodhicitta, and then giving back the vows. So saying to somebody, I no longer want to have the bodhisattva vows, and giving them back. It's the same for the pratimoksha vows. This is how someone gives back their monastic vows, for example, which happens quite frequently. But Tsongkhapa says it's different, because if I am a monk and I give back my vows, it's not negative action to give back my vows. I lose the positive action of continuing to keep them, but the action of giving back my monastic vows is not itself negative. Whereas giving back the bodhisattva vows is, he says it's a very heavy negative karma, because you have vowed to work for the benefit of all other beings, and you say, I relinquish that. Shantideva talks about this if you read in his text, the Bodhisattva Charyavatara. In the 4th chapter, he says, it's like I'm deceiving all sentient beings, because first I say I'm going to save them all from suffering, and then I say I give up on them. Whereas the monastic vows, there could be a good reason for giving them back. There are examples of if somebody is in a situation where they know they can't keep them, and it's better to give back the vow than to break it. But there shouldn't be any good reason for giving back the bodhisattva vow, because as I said before, this isn't something about just this life. It's about from life to life. And so eventually, if I don't want to achieve enlightenment, well, then what am I going to do instead? It's not just about I find it too hard to guard these things. It's also about my particular motivation. Even if it's very hard, you have to have the strong motivation that even if it's very hard, and even if I find that I have a hard time keeping them, and I know that's very negative, still to say I'd rather suffer the consequences of that and learn from it than have the negative, give back the vow and just give up on sentient beings. If we really have that intention, then we shouldn't want to give them back. And then, of course, committing a root downfall with the 4 binding factors that constitutes losing the vow. So I haven't actually, determined it. So Kabbalist has this 4 causes, but I only count 3, and the 3rd one probably divides into 2, but I couldn't figure out from reading how it divided into 2. So that was one further question that I've sent to the senior person, and maybe I'll get an answer before too long. So next we have the secondary faults. Before we go on to that, maybe if anyone has any questions about what we've talked about so far. Yes.
My question is just, how do I make this true? Because it's, I've taken the vows, I've had teachings on the vows, and it's literally like sitting here today, I'm glancing at them again, I'm like, I forgot. So yeah. It's almost like you try and practice and you try and be kind and all that, but definitely that's keeping them top of mind. How do I do that?
Well, one thing is to recite them regularly. As I said, if anyone is reciting the 6 session Guru Yoga, then you're reciting them every day. But at least if you're doing the long version. But even if you can't do that, or if you don't have an empowerment to do that, still, it's good to recite them when you can, just because that way they become natural. And sometimes you might think, oh, it's just by rote. To be honest, I recite them every day, and oftentimes when I'm at the monastery, for example, I'm walking back in the evening at 10 p.m. from the debate, and I'm just reciting them. But at least it's keeping them fresh in my mind. So even though I'm not thinking about them really consciously, I know when I think, oh, what's the fifth one? What's the seventh one? I can try to, okay, that's it, I remember. But then also to continuously go back and read about them. If we find that, I'm forgetting them, to read a book about them again, or to read about, think about them. Because it's certainly the more important thing is one's attitude than the specifics of the details. But at the same time, a lot of the details are very helpful. Like we don't necessarily know how to think about in a certain situation, what's the best way to behave. And it's really, it's not saying you have to do it this or that way. Even more so than the pratimoksha, as I said, with the Bodhisattva vows, it's understood that situations are not so clear cut. And we have to be able to think for ourselves. But at the same time, it's very helpful to have a lot of guidance. This is how people in the past have thought about it. And this is a lot of different guidelines they've given. You don't necessarily have to take it as dogma, but it can be very helpful for guiding our own thinking. So then there can be some sense of, sort of enthusiasm for doing that. Some of them, as I said, just seem a little bit like the 5 actions of non-retribution. I don't find myself in many situations where I'm about to do that. But some of them, especially like praising myself and denigrating others, which is the very first one, that could happen very easily. And it probably does happen. I don't think I've broken the root vow per se with all the binding factors, but there's certainly been times when I've thought, really what I just said was probably, not in accordance with that. And so if I remember at least that's the vow, at least I notice that's what I'm doing, which is much better than not even knowing that you're doing it. So then to start seeing that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Well, on the ninth root downfall, it was not adhering to wrong views, and you gave the example related to the 3 jewels and reincarnation, but that's not comprehensive, right? I mean, what would be included?
Well, those are the main ones.
Those are the main.
So other wrong views. I mean, there could be all kinds of wrong views, and of course all of us have certain wrong views. So if we broke the root vow by having when people thought the earth was flat and everyone thought the earth was flat, then everyone was breaking the vow. But I don't think that's what they're talking about. They're mainly talking about those 2 things, about karma, reincarnation, and then the 3 jewels.
Not the wrong views as defined in like the 6 root afflictions.
Well, the 6 root afflictions, right? The 6th one is views, right? And that's further subdivided into 5, right? And so the first one is the wrong view of a self, right? We say the syntax, say in English, perishing arrogance, yeah. So that's not. And then the extreme views, and then wrong views. That's what it's talking about, wrong views. It's the same thing. The wrong views there is not believing in reincarnation, not believing or not believing, but actively denying reincarnation and 3 jewels. And then holding one's views as superior and holding one's practice as superior, which are actually derivatives. You have to have the wrong views in the first place to have those. The second one, the extreme views, that could have that, because the extreme views is the view of permanence, which is the view that I have an eternal soul that's going to continue when I die, or the view of severance, which when I die, I'm not going to reincarnate. So that would actually overlap with the wrong views. But generally, it's that one, those 2 views. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Question on usually why I say it's phrased destroying places such as towns.
Oh yeah.
How literally that means, places where people live, not necessarily, you could say an anthill.
Right. No, it does say human habitation. That's pretty clear. It does say human habitation in the vow. So yeah, I mean, obviously you don't want to destroy an anthill if you don't have to, but it's to literally break the vow, it has to be human habitation.
Said that
it's not wrong to question something that's not necessarily considered a wrong instead of just like outright denying it. For example, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, when you talk about reincarnation, like some people might have this idea of what reincarnation exactly is.
Yes.
So that does the scripture allow for different interpretations, or does it say no, it's exactly this, and if you don't see it this way, that's a wrong view? It does.
I think it allows for different interpretations for sure. It depends on sort of the degree of how different it is, right? But mainly it's saying that you have the view, but as I said, it's karma and reincarnation both. So right. So first of all, you have the view that when I die, that's it, and then the mind ceases. That's pretty much not believing in reincarnation. But if I believe that I reincarnate, but what I experience in the future life is not related to my actions in this life, that's still denying karma. That's still related to the same view here. So that could be one aspect, one instance of somebody accepting it this way.
Say someone does believe in reincarnation and karma, but they see it like, because I guess like how you interpret the mind, like say this is like the continuous thought, say this is like, we all die, right? And all of our body becomes
Yeah.
That passes on to another being. Is that not also another form of reincarnation in itself, right?
Well, that's one way to think about it. The Buddhist schools all have very different ways of understanding it. So certainly, we wouldn't say that they're, some of them. They all think they're the right one, the other ones are wrong, but they wouldn't say they're breaking the vow per se. But in terms of saying that my physical aggregates thereby are reprocessed as another physical being, that is quite different because it's thereby denying the continuity of mind. It has to do with what is the mind.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. What is the mind? Like, mind is, people say that like cells carry the history of who you are, and that also would not also carry the memory of your thoughts as well. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. There's many different ways to look at it, and I think, as I said before, that I don't think the Buddhist view is necessarily the final one. That there are a lot of things that are not included in that. The Buddhist view, for example, we have the idea that the mind is the brain, which is a very common idea. I personally think that's incorrect, and it's definitely incompatible with the Buddhist view. But at the same time, the idea that there's no relation between the mind and the brain, this seems impossible given all the evidence we have. That relation does not have to be one of either identity, whether the same thing, or even necessarily cause and effect. But there is definitely some kind of relation. And so that's not talked about at all in the Buddhist scriptures. So already there's somewhere where there's a lot of room for expanding our understanding of it. And so in terms of cells, do cells carry memory? Well, what would that mean exactly? There are different ways to understand that. What is a memory? Right? So the kind of standard view in neuroscience is that, well, the most standard view that's accepted basically by anybody who's a materialist neuroscience is that the memory is stored in the brain. But how that happens, actually, there's dispute even now. There's not any clear paradigm that's accepted by everybody. So some would say that individual neurons store memories, and some say it has to do with the connections between neurons. But in either case, it's still understood to be a physical process. Whereas the Buddhist view is quite explicit that a physical thing cannot store memory. It doesn't work that way because the mind is a categorically different thing than the body. If a physical thing stored the memory, then it wouldn't make sense to talk about reincarnation because my cells are regenerated, but if I dissolve into the soil and then eventually that soil becomes the grounds for a plant and then something eats that plant, it's very hard to see, even if the cells were carrying memory, how it could be carried through all that process. And obviously, where does that person then remember my life? Probably not, which is quite different from the idea that there is actually a continuity of consciousness that is carrying imprints into the next life, even if it's not always carrying memories per se. Yeah, even if you don't remember them, but it's carrying certain imprints. So but as I say, we have to be open to different possibilities, because there does seem to be a lot of evidence, or as you say, that there is some relation between cells and and certain patterns of behavior. And so there is definitely some relation between the physical and the mental, perhaps more subtle than what's presented in the traditional Buddhist texts. So I think, there's some of you, I guess you might know Tenzin Gache. He's given teachings here before. I remember when he taught here many years ago, and I attended, and he said that one of his teachers. So if in case you don't know, he is an Indian man who was a Buddhist monk who taught here. He was the chaplain, I guess, at MIT. Yeah, and so he said that one of his teachers, when he was young in the monastery, said to him that when you chant the scriptures, you should chant them like an evangelical Christian. But when you analyze them, you should be like a Marxist. So that's very similar to how we do this. In the monastery, when we're debating, we don't say, oh, I shouldn't question that. I shouldn't take the materialist position. We just take every possible objection that we can find and examine it. So I don't think that it at all is breaking the vow. But in terms of my personal practice, if I then decide, okay, there's a lot of evidence and I don't have an answer right now, versus coming down hardlining and saying there is no continuity of consciousness. Consciousness is a purely physical thing. When the physical body dies, the consciousness ceases, is a very different thing than exploring possibilities in my investigations.
For the fact that
allow for the fact that you don't know. If it broke the vow, then I think there's something wrong with the vow. I wouldn't want to take a vow that says that I should deny the fact that I don't know something when I don't know it. It doesn't leave any room for understanding it. Yeah.
How's that statement up to denigrate Mahayana?
Yes.
But also affecting Mahayana.
Mm-hmm.
Mahayana is form of path to also. How can you do that properly? Is jnana liberation good enough for all sentient beings, or are we trying to usher them to Mahayana enlightenment?
Well, certainly, in the Mahayana vehicle, we want to encourage Hinayana practitioners, if they're ready, to adopt Mahayana and to think about a broader goal. But it's different than saying that what you're doing won't lead to liberation. It will. If somebody sincerely practices Theravada, there should be people who achieve arhatship doing that. And it might be at this point for this person, this is the right path for them. We have to be careful. But there might be cases where it is right to encourage them think about practicing Mahayana. But that not to say that because Theravada is wrong, that's not the point. It's just to say that for liberation, for what it claims to achieve, it can do that. Theravada does not claim to bring anybody to Buddhahood. It actively denies that it can, or that there's such a possibility. But here are these teachings that accept and espouse such a possibility and consider that that might be possible. Yeah. Yes.
What is your understanding of the prayer that may I not be reborn as a Shravaka or Pratimoksha Buddha?
Yeah.
It's so important that actually the prayer.
Well, because it's considered something that takes us off of the path that we're on. So while we don't deny that path can lead to liberation, we prefer not to go there ourselves. Where our goal is full enlightenment, and if we really want that, then to be born in a place where we're therefore led into the Hinayana path, that will be a major obstacle to our achieving enlightenment anytime quickly. It can actually cause it to happen a lot later because we then get stuck in individual liberation and get attached to that. Doesn't mean that it doesn't work.
Relates to one of the downfalls. You sort of get derailed from the Maya.
Yeah, you lose your to say that the Theravada or the Hinayana is ineffective is breaking a vow, but also to adopt it as one's own practice and reject Mahayana is also breaking the vow. Okay. No questions on the Zoom, is there? Okay, so we'll move on to the secondary faults. We can't go through every individual one of them. It's 46. But as an overview, first of all, these are all related to one of the 6 perfections, or actually 7, because we have the 6 perfections I mentioned earlier of generosity, ethical discipline, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. And then also the 7th, we call 7th perfection of skillful means. So all of these are grouped or classed as ones that then harm our practice of one of these perfections. Personally, I find these very practical. As I said, some of the root vows I find actually less relevant. Like, I've not actually been in a position personally, not just the 5 actions of immediate retribution, but where I'm likely to steal a monastic's robe or destroy somebody's house. I mean, that some people could be, but a lot of the secondary ones relate very directly to things that I experience every day. So I find it very helpful to go through them again and again. And so if we want to practice generosity, for example, we have 7 faults inharmonious with the practice of generosity. That if this is advice on if you really want to practice generosity, doing this opposite thing will get in the way of that. And that's why there's secondary faults, because you don't commit a root downfall, but it's a fault. So I could say from the pratimoksha, which I know better because we've been studying this in the monastery, we have 5 different classes of vows. So the first one I mentioned before was a defeat, where you lose your vows. This is the heaviest. But the 5th class is the lightest, which is called just false, which is similar. It's the same word in Tibetan, in Nietzsche, which means that it's just something wrong, that you don't want to behave that way. But for most of the faults, there's no consequence per se. So if I'm a monk and I commit one of the faults that are the 5th class of vow, I don't even have to confess it. But it's just acknowledging that this is not something I want to do, because it's incongruent with the kind of life I'm trying to lead. So likewise with these, they're just it's a practice of mindfulness. And mindfulness really means a practice of remembrance, of keeping in mind the kind of things that I'm trying to cultivate. And these are advice on the kind of things that we're going to detract from that. So first we have the practice of generosity. So we have 7 faults. So the first one is not offering 3 times to the 3 jewels. So in every day, at least 3 times, we should make offerings to the 3 jewels. So, and as I said before, these all fit into the 3 kinds of ethical discipline or morality. So here we have gathering virtue, morality of gathering virtue. So making offerings is a way of gathering virtue, accumulating virtue. This is something fairly easy to do, to make offerings. And by not doing so, then we're committing this fault, because we have the opportunity to do so and to create virtue. So, easy things to do are like making water bowl offerings, making lamp offerings, and so forth, or making offerings to the Dharma center, things like that. That's all included in making offerings to the 3 jewels. But at the very least, simply to mentally or to recite, I make offerings. So again, I don't know if any of you recite the 6 Session Guru Yoga. I keep mentioning this, but that's one thing that's included in there, is to recite 3 times a day, or actually 6 times in that context. I make offerings to the 3 jewels, even if you're not physically offering anything. Because of course, if you're, for example, a retreatant who's practicing in the mountains, you don't have all this material that you keep putting on your altar, but you just mentally make an offering to the 3 jewels. And that's enough to not contradict the vow. Is just to to do that at least 8 times a day, and remember that. So yeah, we said the secondary faults. Most of them are divided into diluted and non-diluted faults. So diluted is more heavy. So it's a motivation of disrespect, idleness due to lack of faith, or delight in misdeeds. It's a diluted fault. So I think I'm not going to give to the 3 jewels because I don't respect them, or I don't really care because I don't think it's worthwhile to do so, or that I'm so distracted with all the misdeeds that I'm doing that I don't have time to offer. But then due to forgetfulness is a non-diluted fault. So that's pretty practical. It's better not to forget, but if we do, it's a fairly light thing. So then what are the 3 jewels? So it could be any of them. The Buddha is an actual Buddha, or representations is a statue. The Dharma jewel is both the realized Dharma, we mentioned earlier about the truth of path and truth of cessation, and the scriptural Dharma, the Dharma texts. But it says here it's specifically Mahayana. So you have to make offerings to the Mahayana Dharma in order to fulfill this. And the Sangha jewel is an Arya Bodhisattva. It's not just a monk or a nun in this case. The action is not to offer one's body, speech, and mind on a daily basis to the 3 jewels by prostrating, verbally praising, and appreciating their good qualities. So he doesn't even mention here actually material offerings. It's more offering oneself, offering one's practice, offering praise. So then second, following desirous thoughts. So as I said, we just break this by the way we think. So the fault is a degeneration of the antidote to miserliness. So the motivation is strong desire, a lack of contentment or attachment to honor and gain. So the action is to follow after those afflictions, that is, willingly act upon them without making an effort to apply an antidote. So we start thinking, oh, how wonderful it would be to have such and such thing, and not recognizing that our mind is just going wild with attachment. And then we just immediately act and go out and buy it, or steal it even. But here, that would fall into different things. So we can just say here, buying it, without having any effort to apply a fault, or to recognize that we're acting under desire. Doesn't mean we should never buy anything. When we say desire, it's talking about attachment. We say desire attachment. It means we are exaggerating the qualities. Thinking if I had this new car, even though I already have a car that works perfectly fine, but this new car is so much more impressive than the old one, I'll just buy this new one. And not have making any effort to apply an antidote, which would be to think, well, if I had this new car, would I be any happier? To reason with ourselves, or to think about the faults of, if I had this new car, it looks so wonderful, but I could get killed in this car, or in 20 years it's not going to look so wonderful. These kinds of things. So Tsongkhapa says, if the vow holder intentionally makes a sincere effort to apply an antidote, but is still overwhelmed by afflictions and acts on it, there is no fault contravening the vow. You don't break the vow. But it doesn't say it. He says it's still naturally faulty in the sense that one is still accumulating some karma of having acted on attachment, but it doesn't break the vow. The breaking the vow is to act without making any effort to apply an antidote. The third is not showing respect to elders. So these are inharmonious with the generosity of giving freedom from fear. Right? There's different kinds of generosity, giving material objects, giving teachings, and then giving freedom from fear, which means that we save people or animals from danger. So this is related to a specific object, elders. So a motivation such as pride, malice, or anger is diluted fault, and then idleness, laziness, neutral, or forgetfulness is non-diluted. So the action here is that one knows to be a bodhisattva who is senior to oneself, meaning that they have taken bodhisattva vows earlier. And the action is to fail to pay respect by rising and offering a seat, or otherwise failing to show respect in accordance with prevailing social conventions. So again, I said this morning about a monastic, as a monastic, junior monks show me respect. I try to see it as it's not that I'm so great because I'm a senior person, it's that I've had these vows that I'm carrying have more power because I've carried them longer. And therefore, I allow people to show respect to that as a way of thereby myself generating respect for where these vows came from, is their source in the Buddha. So likewise, with the Bodhisattva vows, it's not, even if we think this person is insincere and I know that they're not a good practitioner, that doesn't matter. I still show them respect. This is how we behave in the monastery. It's just natural for us now. I show respect to senior people and I bow before them. I don't care if I think they're not sincere. That's really not my purpose in bowing to them. It's that I myself generate respect for the vows that they're carrying, and I do have respect for those vows, even if I know that they're not really making a sincere effort to practice it. So I won't go through all the points here, just because we don't have obviously time to go through everything. Then the fourth one is not responding to questions. So this is somebody who has asked a sincere question and you don't respond in a sincere and appropriate manner. But again, there could be all kinds of exceptions. And one of them is that you do it as a way to tame them, meaning that, if I'm a teacher and I know somebody is really arrogant and thinks that they have the best question and they're trying to show off their knowledge by asking me that question, and I just dismiss what they say as a way of helping them to overcome their pride, that's very different than just, it says here, the motivation has to be a kind of pride or arrogance. I just don't have time for this person. I don't care about what they have to say. Then we have not accepting an invitation. So this is the opposite, that we're practicing generosity. We also have to create the opportunity for others to practice generosity. So if somebody invites me to dinner or to something where they're going to have the opportunity to be generous to me, and I refuse their invitation. So again, we had the ethical disciplines, the three different moralities. The morality of enacting the welfare of sentient beings, that we give opportunity for others to generate merit. But again, of course, the motivation has to be pride, resentment, or anger. And so if I'm sick, for example, or as a monk, as I said, we don't eat dinner. So if somebody invites me to dinner and I say, well, I don't eat dinner, that's a good reason. It's not because I'm just being prideful, or that there's danger. They invite me and I know that by going, I'm going to put myself in danger, things like that. But if it's done out of pride or resentment, I think that this person is very poor and I don't want to accept their offering because I'm much more superior to them. That's very different. Or that if it says if it's done out of indolence or laziness, that's a non-diluted fault. It's still a fault, but not as serious as a diluted fault. And then not accepting requisites. So it's similar, that somebody offers you something and you refuse to take what they give you. But again, it depends on your motivation for doing so. And not giving to those who seek Dharma. So you remember the second vow was not to teach Dharma when somebody asks. But that had to be done with the miserliness. Whereas here, it's a motivation of resentment or anger or jealousy. So these are the 7 related to generosity. Next, we have 9 faults inharmonious with the perfection of ethical discipline. So the first is forsaking those of broken ethics. I'm going to have to go through them more quickly now, but this is if somebody else has lost their ethical discipline, and then just to ignore them and say, I don't care about them anymore. Not training for the sake of others' faith, which means that we recognize that if I practice ethical discipline, other people are going to see that as a good example. So then to ignore that and not train myself, such that others, especially for somebody who is a monastic, who is supposed to be technically in a position of being an example of ethical discipline, I just ignore to do that, then I set a very bad example for others. So that would be going against this vow. And then doing little for the welfare of others. So this actually means something very specific. This is worth going over in some detail. So the motivation is resentment or anger, and the object is other beings. But the is to refuse to contravene a proscribed pratimoksha vow which a bodhisattva has consent when doing so would benefit others. So I mentioned we have two kinds of monastic vows, the pratimoksha vows, also lay vows, pratimoksha vows. We have naturally negative actions, which is not being talked about here. Then we have prescribed negative actions. So you might remember I said with killing. To kill somebody is naturally a negative action. To dig a hole in the ground is a prescribed negative action. So if I'm a bodhisattva, I have a bodhisattva vow, and somebody wants me to dig a hole in the ground because there's a really good reason to do so. Maybe it's going to save them. There's somebody stuck in a well, and they ask me to dig down into the well and get them. I say, no, I'm not going to do so because I have a vow against digging the earth. Then I've broken this vow. It's to refuse to break the prescribed vows when actually there's a good reason to benefit somebody else. So he gives a lot of examples, Tsongkhapa. So, for example, for monastics, there's the vows to have few desires, or keep few possessions, and being content with only the most poor quality requisites. But then a bodhisattva monk might accumulate many possessions in order to serve others. But it says that individual practitioners are advised to consider their own situation and level of detachment. If they are able to accumulate possessions without increasing their mental afflictions, they have permission to do so for others' benefit. But for less advanced practitioners, it may be preferable to continue adhering closely to their pratimoksha vows. So again, with all of these, we see how it really forces us to think about it. It's not like this is the right way to do it, and it's right or wrong, but it's very good advice to think about. There are situations where we can contravene these things. So then the next vow is even stronger. Not committing non-virtue on compassionate grounds. So this is specifically saying that I refuse to engage in a naturally negative action when doing so could benefit others. So the motivation is the same. It's out of resentment or anger. So to refuse to engage in any of the 7 non-virtues of body and speech. So killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, harsh speech, slander, and idle speech, in the context of a specific special situation where the Buddha has given permission to engage in those for the welfare of sentient beings. So Tsongkhapa gives a very lengthy explanation here, which I decided not to go in because I think it's like 5 or 6 pages long. I couldn't just put it all in this little summary here. But I encourage people, if they want to read about it. It's also discussed in Gache Sonam Rinpoche's book. I said page 141 to 4, and Dr. Rinpoche's book also. And then Mark Tatz in his translations, he takes up 8 pages. But the main point is that a vow holder should only perform, so this is important, such negative action when it will be of immense benefit to others and there is no alternative means. So it's not just a sort of a free license to do whatever you want, but it's saying in certain situations where it's immense benefit to engage in this negative action and there is no alternative, then there's not just permission, it's actually breaking the Bodhisattva vow not to do it. So also for ordained vow holders, we have to recognize that it still can create a defeat. So if I'm a monk and I have Bodhisattva vows and I kill somebody compassionately, I still lose my monastic vows. There's no permission in that context. But in terms of the Bodhisattva vow, it's a different thing. Also, Tsongkhapa emphasizes that the Bodhisattva must have spontaneous bodhicitta and be motivated by great compassion. And some people say that some teachers consider that the vow is only applicable to those who achieve the Bodhisattva path of preparation. Because before that point, practitioners will lack wisdom to know when it is truly appropriate to commit such actions, and the skill to do so they'll lack the skill to do so in a compassionate way. So again, it's a lot of warnings here. It's not just saying for anybody at any time. So one example we could see, which could be relevant to a lot of other modern examples, but this is in Tibetan history. Clearly, the person doing this believed they were enacting this vow. Some of you might know in the 9th century, for some time, Tibet was ruled by kings who, for several generations, were strong supporters of Buddhism. And the last of these was Sri Rinpoche, whose brother Langdharma killed him and took over the kingdom, and then stopped supporting the monasteries. And at least according to many historical accounts, it was not just lack of support, it was active suppression. There's questions about the degree to which that was going on. But in any case, due to the lack of support, the monasteries lost funds, and it was quite a dire situation for Buddhism in Tibet. So there was one monk named Lalung Pelgi Dorje who decided to assassinate Langdharma. So the first thing he did was give back his monastic vows, because he knew that if he did this action as a monk, he would lose his monastic vows. It's interesting how he did this action, because there's quite a lot of historical attestation, I guess, historical evidence attesting to this. It's not just a fable, or I could have put story. He dressed up in white clothing and rode on a white horse, but then he painted everything in charcoal, so it was completely black. And then he went and shot the king with a crossbow, and then rode away and jumped into a river, so that all the charcoal came off. And then the horse was white again, and he was white again, so nobody could catch him. And he managed to escape this way. So he was successful in assassinating the king. And for the rest of his life, he stayed in retreat, practicing purification to atone for what he'd done. So clearly he took it very seriously. He didn't just see this as something, light. In Tibetan history, I wouldn't say he's considered a hero, but generally it's kind of presented as he did what had to be done. But it is some questionable reading different historical accounts of whether it really was beneficial. I don't know, because the result of his doing that was within 2 years the Tibetan Empire collapsed, and Tibet fell into a dark age for a century. I mean, that may have happened anyway. I really don't know. Nobody really knows. I mean, there's a lot of debate about these things. But did that actually help? It was at least a century before Buddhism was revived in Tibet. So it's questionable. We have to be very careful and think, okay, I'm going to assassinate this evil leader. It can often lead to much, worse results. For example, one thing we could see is some of these Middle Eastern countries where it's gone in and the leader's been assassinated, and it's clear the leader was an immoral person. But it's questionable whether it has actually improved the situation to have radically altered the government in that way. And so it's. This is why Tsongkhapa says we have to be very careful and know what is going to be the long-term consequences of the action. But it is very clear in these vows that there is, again, not only permission, but that one is breaking the vow when one really knows that doing this action will have benefit in the long run, more benefit than harm, and one refuses to act on it simply because, I'm a monk and I don't do that kind of thing, or I don't want to create negative karma for myself. Sometimes, killing is a pretty serious thing, but there could be a lot of other situations where, like I said earlier about the monks, spraying insecticide on the mosquitoes. That is clearly, if they're thinking about it, I assume they're giving it some thought before they're doing it. They're probably thinking about this vow. That, at least in their understanding, by doing this, they're going to be preventing a lot of people from getting sick, and that. Rather than thinking I'm not going to do that because I don't want to create negative karma for myself, I'll take that on myself and accept the consequences of that action in order to be a benefit to others. So next we have readily accepting wrong livelihoods. It talks about ethics related to oneself. So we have the ethical discipline or the morality of restraint. So the motivation is any affliction, coupled with lack of shame or hesitation, is to adopt a wrong livelihood. And wrong livelihoods are generally enumerated as 5. So it's 5 ways, a livelihood in the sense of ways of gaining materials, mainly, getting wealth and so forth. So it's mainly talking about ways that monks and nuns can behave, but also lay people might engage in something similar to this. So the first is called hypocritical ethics. So that is, I'm a monk, and I intentionally act like I'm really subdued and peaceful, with the thought that if I do so, people are going to make offerings to me. And then secondly, flattery for gaining respect. So I meet a lay person and I tell them how wonderful they are, knowing that they're going to make offerings to me. Or hinting. So this is like I'm a monk and I go into somebody's house and I say, that's such a nice picture you have there. Thinking, maybe they'll give it to me. Or extortion. So maybe that for lay people, this could also be the case, is insulting or belittling others to make them give you something. And then calculated generosity, whereas that you give somebody a little gift, thinking they'll probably give me more in return. So all of these are considered wrong livelihood. But then Tsongkhapa adds that wrong livelihood also includes dealing in business that sells alcohol, weapons, poison, or animals for slaughter, or similar things, or crushing seeds without inspecting them. This is kind of a big thing in the Vinaya. But really the point of this is that one should not recklessly despoil the environment. Because the idea in ancient India was that a seed has the potential to grow into a tree or a plant. So by destroying them, you're destroying that potential. But the understanding is that this is negative, harmful to the environment. So really, I think the understanding is engaging in a livelihood that's harmful to the environment. And then excitedly engaging in carefree behavior. This is just to, it says, engage in activities like games, uproarious laughter, or distracting chatter, or encourage others to do so, because this, of course, just leads us into more distraction and opens the ground for creating more negative actions in the future. The motivation is excitement, which is a derivative form of attachment. It's an unsettledness of body and mind. But then there is no fault if the vow holder is sincerely trying to overcome these behaviors, but also wants, this is I think more important, wants to relieve others' sorrow or animosity. So that somebody is not doing this because they're just out of their own attachment, but because they know by laughing with this person, they're going to help them to work through their sorrow, or intends to bring others into virtuous behavior. So it's often said in the sutras that Bodhisattva will engage in what is normally considered wrong behavior and become part of society, such that people gain respect for them and gradually encourage them to give up these behaviors. Or to counteract harmful misunderstanding that might develop from not taking part. So if people are going to generate a negative view of Buddhists because, I don't do that kind of thing, and then there might be a reason to do so. But then Tsongkhapa clarifies the motivation should be altruistic rather than attachment. So it could be that we can do it for those reasons, but we really have to have that motivation, that it's altruism and not just acting out of attachment. There's a lot of other details here. That's also a thing with all kinds of possibilities. So then we have intending to travel alone in samsara, meaning that there's a misunderstanding we can have in the Bodhisattva teachings. It says that we should not be afraid of samsara, that we should not just want to be free of samsara, and we should be willing to jump into samsara in order to free others. But this doesn't mean that we just feel it's great to be in samsara and I just wander around doing, for hundreds of lifetimes. It's actually, we should have very strong renunciation, but at the same time be willing to undergo a longer path in order to achieve a higher goal. It's to counteract this misunderstanding. So again, I don't have time, I think, to go through every one of them now, but I'll highlight some of the ones that I think are very important. So that I'll finish here with the ethical discipline, and then we have patience. So I mentioned this earlier, returning abuse with abuse and so forth, returning anger with anger. Neglecting angry people. So somebody else is angry and I just don't take the time to help them overcome their anger. Or not accepting an apology. So we had this earlier, if one motivation if there's holding a grudge, that constitutes the third downfall. But here it's out of anger or hostility, but not holding a grudge. Then this is constituting the secondary fault. And following angry thoughts. This is similar to earlier we said following desirous thoughts. So we have angry thoughts and we don't make any effort to apply an antidote. We just act on our angry thoughts. And then we have joyous effort. So gathering our retinue with a wish for gain and respect. So as a bodhisattva, if we're qualified, we should gather our retinue of disciples in order to help them. But if our motivation is just that we want people to praise us, that's very different. Not dispelling laziness, so that we fail to apply any antidote to being lazy. And engaging in idle chatter out of attachment, so just wasting our time with frivolous activities. And then the perfection of concentration. So we have not pursuing concentration, not making an effort to develop meditative concentration. And not eliminating hindrances to concentration. So the hindrances to concentration mainly are excitement and regret, ill will, sleep and lethargy, desire for sense pleasures, and afflicted doubt. So it's not not making an effort to rid ourselves of these which hinder concentration. But then the corollary to that, the opposite perhaps, is viewing the bliss of concentration as an end in itself. So thinking that I just want to achieve peaceful meditative concentration, and that's enough for me. As opposed to seeing that for the Bodhisattva path, concentration is a very useful tool, but can be actually a distraction if we get too involved in just sitting in these states of bliss and blissful concentration. And then 8 faults related to the perfection of wisdom. A lot of these, again, I think are very practical. So again, abandoning the hearer vehicle. So earlier we had claiming that the teachings are not, that the Hinayana is not the Buddha's teachings. That's the 6th root downfall. And the 13th was causing someone else to give up their vows. And the 14th was claiming that these teachings are not sufficient for purifying affliction. So here it simply does not claim that they're worthless, but says that the person says that I believe that because they are inferior to Mahayana teachings, one who practices Mahayana needn't bother to learn them, memorize them, or practice them. So it's discouraging people from spending time studying these practices and engaging in them. But then the opposite is putting undue effort into the hearer vehicle while neglecting the Mahayana. So we want to practice them, but not to the extreme that we neglect the Mahayana practices. And then putting inordinate effort into non-Buddhist teachings. So this one I think is very interesting because, as I've said, in my many years in the monastery, I spent a lot of time reading a lot of non-Buddhist things. Now, of course, we have to have a question of where they draw the line between what is Buddhist and non-Buddhist. But for example, studying science and so forth. And His Holiness Dalai Lama always encouraged us to do that. Actually, at the monastery right now, they're in the process of building a very large science center. So I don't think we'd say that's all against the Bodhisattva vow. But Tsongkhapa, so he points out here, he says that first of all, the action is to neglect putting effort into Buddhist teachings and instead put effort into the study and practice of non-Buddhist teachings. So it's not that we engage them in general, but that it detracts from our practice of the Buddhist teachings. And then secondly, Tsongkhapa says that there are situations where somebody might actually be qualified. And he says there are certain qualities that a Bodhisattva vow holder might have that would entail that it would be useful for them to study on Buddhist teachings, which is one, they have an attentive mind in this sense of quickly remembering new material, quickly grasping new concepts, is able to keep information in mind for a long time without forgetting it, is focused on the goal and sharpened mind, meaning that they are continually focused on enlightenment. It's not going to derail them to study something else. Has clear wisdom that easily understands, and has an unwavering mind toward the Buddha's teachings due to realizing them with reasoning. In that case, there is no fault for such a vow holder to put effort into non-Buddhist teachings, as long as he or she devotes at least twice as much time each day to studying and practicing Buddhist teachings. I think practically as a monk, I take that as important advice. In the monastery, I probably spend more than 2/3 of my day studying Buddhist teachings, but I try to spend at least an hour a day reading non-Buddhist material, and sometimes more. It's not just a matter of of enjoyment. It really enhances both our understanding of the teachings. It gives us a much broader way of understanding how things exist in general, as opposed to just one view of things. And of course, the traditional way it's presented is it helps us to teach others. It's not helpful if you can't really understand what somebody else's background. There's an example even in the sutras, which is this is not a Bodhisattva sutra. This is in the Pali Canon of Shariputra. Some of you might know the Buddha's closest disciple, who was spending a fair amount of time learning about the non-Buddhist systems of thought at the time in ancient India. And somebody complained to the Buddha. There were quite a few instances in the sutras where people complained to the Buddha about Shariputra's behavior. And the Buddha almost, I think 100% of the time, would say actually what he was doing is correct. He understood it better. So he said, well, actually, what he's doing is very beneficial. He should keep doing that, because he's going to be a much more benefit if he studies the non-Buddhist systems. And then but he's doing it more and more, and somebody complained, well, he's doing it too much. And the Buddha still again said he can do it as much as he wants. In his case, he was pretty clear. It's not just for anybody, but certainly in Shariputra's case, the more he does it, the better. Because as much as he, in his own discretion, feels is adequate, that is going to be very beneficial in his ability to have discussions with non-Buddhists. So we have to maybe be able to judge for ourselves, for one thing. We'll use these, as Tsongkhapa gives these guidelines. If studying non-Buddhist teachings is causing us to lose our faith and our ground in the practice, then it can be detrimental to our practice. But we have to know for ourselves where that line is, and maybe be able to also have, that's why we live in communities. It's not just judging yourself, but being able to have recommendations from others. But sometimes, as we see with Shariputra, sometimes others might not know as well as oneself. So it's be very careful and look at it very closely. And then the opposite. So we had, what was it? This one was putting inordinate effort into non-Buddhist teachings, but then we have excessive joy in non-Buddhist teachings. So the action is to take great pleasure in non-Buddhist teachings, developing such a keen interest that one loses track of one's own view and practice. So Tsongkhapa explains that with caution and without excessive aspiration, one should engage in non-Buddhist text for a particular purpose, such as to learn logic and grammar, or understand others' viewpoints, as though resorting to a strong medicine, something that one does in a cautious, calculated manner, so as to be aware that we don't want to have this be so strong that we lose our faith. Now, of course, as we talked about earlier, if our faith is really wrong, then probably we should lose it. So it could seem that it's not. It could be saying, well, don't go so far as to question your belief system. That's really not the point here. But Buddhism is not just about beliefs. A lot of it is about practice, and these practice of refuge and Bodhisattva vows is something we've committed to as to how we're living our life. And we have to be careful if we really want to continue that life. If we get so caught up in all kinds of popular views that contradict that, it can derail us. We've seen that happen many times. People who, for example, in the monastery, we see monks and nuns. I mean, not nuns in our monastery, but I could say for monks, that some of them get very attached to a particular way of seeing things, and they really lose their aspiration to continue as a monastic, which in the long run I think can be quite harmful to them. It's not just a matter of, you should allow them to think whatever they want. That's not the point. Of course, anyone's allowed to think whatever they want, but this person has committed to a particular lifestyle, and they've tried. Some part of them really wanted to do this, and they kind of lose their direction. It's like somebody who gets married and then gets very attracted to somebody else. It's not that other person is bad in and of themselves, but it just it breaks apart the marriage, and it is unlikely to have positive consequences in the long run for both parties if that's if it's done if it's done in a way that, as I say, just kind of breaks it apart. which is what can happen if we're not careful. And this practice we're undertaking is a commitment we've made, and the other spiritual paths are perfectly valid for the people who are practicing them. But if we get so strongly involved in one that we lose track of one, it's likely to become a continuing pattern. Then the next one just seems just that much better. So yeah, I think, as I said, these I think are two of the most important ones, because they play on each other, and it's very clear that there's not an easy answer. The vow itself is giving a lot of leeway for using your own wisdom, but it's giving also a lot of advice about, you might think about it this way. This is a different way to consider. Be careful about how you might engage in these things. And then 3 faults related with superior wisdom. These first ones were about mundane wisdom. So superior wisdom is to reject a Mahayana text. So earlier we had rejecting the entire Mahayana corpus. Here we have rejecting a particular text. I have quite a lot here, because this obviously is something that we have to, it's quite complicated. I won't get into it a lot, but really the motivation here has to be, it's important, one's own misconceptions or following others' incorrect explanations. So it's very different than examining some document that we found and really critically asking, is this a Mahayana text or not? And was this taught by the Buddha and so forth? It's more that we adopt a critical attitude out of a wrong view. So I have, for example, Nagarjuna. He talks about this in his text, The Precious Garland, because there were definitely many people that we can see in ancient India who were rejecting the Mahayana teachings. So it was something that he often responded to. So Nagarjuna says, what Tathagatas teach with an intention is not known easily. So intention here means an sort of ulterior purpose, that the Buddha said something that was not, the immediate meaning was not obvious in the words. So it says not known easily. He taught 1 vehicle, then 3. So the Buddha taught, to some people he taught that everyone will eventually be enlightened. But to some people he taught that that's not the case, that some people will only achieve solitary realization and liberation. So Nagarjuna says, with equanimity, guard yourself. So adopt a neutral attitude when you don't know. Neutrality is not negative, but anger is non-virtuous. So wishing goodness for yourself toward Mahayana, anger is amiss. So be careful. That doesn't mean just accept it, but when you recognize that you don't know, adopt a neutral attitude rather than getting angry at it, which is what we talked about. Really, the point here is to reject it out of anger or misconceptions. And then we have praising oneself or deprecating others. We talked about earlier. And the root vow is in terms of attachment, but here the motivation is pride or anger. And then we have not going for the sake of the Dharma, meaning that somebody is giving a teaching and we don't attend the teaching. Now, that doesn't mean we have to attend every teaching that's given in every place at all times. So, of course, there's a lot of caveats here. So we have that the motivation is arrogance, anger, or resentment. Or a non-diluted fault would be laziness or indolence. And the object is somebody giving a Dharma teaching or a discourse associated with the Dharma, such as a lecture on Buddhist history. The action is not to attend. But then here, the vow holder doesn't attend. There's many reasons that you don't have a fault. You're unaware of the teaching, which I hope would not be a fault. Otherwise, we're all going to be getting a lot of faults every day. Being sick or otherwise unable to attend. Suspecting that the teaching is incorrect. Knowing that they will be unable to understand the teaching. Or having heard such teachings many times and already gained a good understanding. Or being more devoted to serious Dharma activities, such as single-pointed concentration. Or wishing to avoid upsetting one's main teacher by visiting another teacher. Obviously, there's many cases that we could see. It would make sense that this wouldn't be a fault. But the point is that when we do have the opportunity, it's very good to attend Dharma teachings. And to not do so just because we're lazy or because we're arrogant. Oh, even though we know that this teaching is very valuable, we don't like that person. We don't want to be seen as taking teachings from them. That might constitute this fault. And then deprecating the speaker and preferring the words, which means that Yeah, so it's saying that this is similar to what I was just talking about, that the teacher has, there's a particular person that we might not have a lot of respect for in terms of a personal way, not because they're like evil or something, but just because we feel that I'm superior to them in whatever way. But they're teaching something that's really very valuable, and therefore we don't pay attention to that. We just deprecate the person and don't take an interest in what they're saying. We have to be very careful. So it talks about the 4 reliances. This is talked about often in Mahayana teaching, that you should rely on the Dharma, not the person. So it's not about who is teaching it in terms of their personal, as long as they're an ethical person, in terms of whether they're physically attractive or popular or whatever. And then as to the Dharma, rely on the meaning and not the words. And the meaning, rely on the definitive meaning, not the interpretive, meaning that really get to the essence of what's being said and not just how it sounds. And then as the definitive meaning, rely on apprehending it with deep wisdom and not merely intellectually. So then we have 12 faults in the harmonious with enacting the welfare of sentient beings. These are all related to the practice of skillful means. So I don't have time, again, to go through all of them. We're really kind of toward the end here, in depth, but I'll just read them quickly. So not going when help is needed, and refusing to serve the sick. Not removing suffering, meaning not helping somebody to get over their sadness and so forth. Not teaching what is accurate to the careless. Not repaying others' help. Not assuaging others' sorrow. I think the earlier one might have been something slightly different, but anyway, not giving to those seeking sustenance. So like not giving to beggars and so forth. Not working for the welfare of one's followers. Not conforming to suit others' minds. Meaning that we don't try to teach in a way that's suitable to the capacity of the disciples. Not speaking in praise of good qualities. Not subjugating others in accordance with the conditions. So this means that it's somebody who's practicing non-virtue and not making an effort to bring them under control, to stop them from creating this non-virtue for themselves. So it has to be a motivation of affliction. The person is fit to be rebuked, punished, or expelled. The action is not to rebuke, punish, or expel them as a means to help them. But of course, there are many exceptions here. So if the vow holder is waiting for an appropriate time, the person is unmendable, such that they are exceptionally hostile and don't listen to advice. If they possess shame and embarrassment, such that they will naturally rectify their own mistakes. If the person is likely to become quarrelsome, derisive, disputatious, or argumentative. So then it says many teachers emphasize that in relation to situations where a person needs to be punished, the vow holder should first wait until his or her anger subsides before actually carrying out the punishment. That's also good advice. It's good to do so if it will help them, but we don't want to do it, diluted by our own anger. And then finally, the 46th, the last one, may not apply to all of us, but it says not using psychic powers to threaten and so forth. So this is somebody who's actually achieved psychic powers. They have clairvoyance, or the ability to emanate forms and so forth. And they don't use those powers when it would actually be beneficial. So threaten is like if somebody is about to engage in a negative action and we show a wrathful form to stop them from that. Or there are examples in the teachings, actually. Some of you might know this if you've ever read the story of the Buddha's life. Like there was the cousin of the Buddha, Nanda, who was a layperson at the time, who was very, very attached to his wife mainly. And the Buddha was trying to show him and encourage him to become a monastic because he knew that he had the karma to do so. So he showed him all these visions that encouraged him to overcome his attachment. The first he showed him the sort of like Christmas Carol, I think, isn't that when they showed him the consequences? So he showed him what's going to happen to you if you continue with this desirous action in the next life. And here's what's going to happen to you if you become a monk. And through those visions, then he was able to overcome his attachment, much to the chagrin of his wife, unfortunately. So there are examples of that we see in the sutras, and the point is, if somebody really has the ability to do so, not to use it in a context where it's helpful would be to break this vow. But then Chandra Gomin, I mentioned, these 46 vows are all listed in his text, and the very last lines of his text are, "With sympathy for love's concern, with virtuous mind no fault ensues." So basically he's saying, if you're doing this out of compassion with a good motivation, then there's no fault. So for all of these, Tsongkhapa says, if the vow holder acts with compassion and love, with the wish to benefit, and genuinely wishes to tame others, there is no fault. So really, it depends on your motivation. Of course, we can't just have that as a justification for unwise behavior, but if we really are sincerely trying to practice, and we're practicing with compassion, then it's very hard to break these vows. Really, it depends on your motivation and your mental state. So yeah, I'll finish. We have time for questions, but I'll just read, because Shantideva, I don't have time to go through the book that I brought here, but I translated a couple of his verses here that are sort of encouraging for when we take the vows, the importance of maintaining them. So he says, if having promised in this way, I fail to undertake the work, deceiving all these sentient beings, what sort of being will I become? Examine first the work to do. Commence the work or don't commence. To not commence is preferable, but having started, don't turn back. Our habits stay in future lives. Suffering in sin will thus increase. And other works and their results will be delayed and won't get done. He's saying, if you examine if you can do this, if you can take these vows, and if you feel you can, if you feel you can't, then it's better not to take them. But if you take them, then it's better not to turn back, because you'll just create the habit to keep doing so in the future. And so in the future life, you'll just have the same result again. So even if it's hard, and it will be hard, it's unlikely to be easy, it's something worth persevering with. So I'll finish there in terms of discussion, but we might have question and answer.
Question online was about the role of Pure Lands, and you pray to be reborn in the Pure Land so as to have more time to meditate for becoming enlightened, as opposed to praying for a perfect human rebirth.
Yeah, that's a good question about Pure Lands. So, generally speaking, in the Buddhist worldview, there are what we call Pure Lands, which are world systems that arise, because our world system, it's understood, it arises through the karma of the beings that have the karma to inhabit it. So all of us collectively, for many, many lifetimes, we created actions that caused this universe that we live in to manifest. It's not something that has happened from one action, but the collection of many, many. Like in the same way, there's these parables of like a butterfly flaps its wings and 65 million years ago, and what's the result today? It's very hard to just pinpoint what's the cause of the weather today. But there's not causeless. There's something that brought it about. And it's understood that this comes about through the karma of the beings that are experiencing it. Pure Land is slightly different. It's a realm of existence that comes about through the dependent arising of a particular Buddha, an enlightened being, who makes prayers to be able to teach beings in a more direct way. And then the prayers of those beings to be born in that place. And in that case, then it manifests as a realm where there is sort of a continuous understanding of Dharma. It's not, like I mentioned earlier, this world we live in being arisen from karma and afflictions, being the nature of suffering. The Pure Land is not. It's not in the nature of suffering. It's not arisen from diluted karma. So it sounds obviously great. Why, the question of why would anyone not want to go there? But there's a couple of things. One is most of these Pure Lands are understood to be accessible only to Arya Bodhisattvas. That it's somewhere, at least in the many of the Mahayana sutras, it talks about advanced Arya Bodhisattvas needing to be born in these places in order to achieve very high states. Like in some sutras, like the Lankavatara Sutra, that Ascent to Lanka Sutra, it says that it's really only possible to achieve enlightenment if one is born into a certain kind of Pure Land. It's not possible to achieve this in a human realm. Now, this will actually be questioned in even more advanced teachings, but in certain sutras, it makes that claim. But there is an exception, mainly in terms of it understood the Buddha Amitabha was said to manifest the Pure Land of Sukhavati, or of blissful Pure Land. And it said that the Amitabha made the specific vow that beings who are even ordinary beings could be born there, such that he could teach them. And so in the Buddhist worldview, this is understood to be a place where beings can be born if they pray very strongly to be born there. So this is why, for example, in East Asia, an entire sect of Buddhism called Pure Land Buddhism arose with this understanding based on the sutra, where the main practice is to be prayed to be born in Amitabha's Pure Land. So for one thing, our tradition has certain ways of understanding this. It's certainly not rejected. It's accepted as this is correct. But for one thing, it says it's not so easy. It's not just a matter of, although the sutra says you pray and you're born there, that's provisional teaching. It's not something that actually holds weight under analysis. But it's encouraging. It can encourage us, somebody who might otherwise feel discouraged and think that Buddhism is so heavy and saying that you can't get anywhere, by saying there is this possibility. And in certain cases, it might be possible, depending on the person's karma and the strength of the prayer, as I talked about earlier. Just saying it once is very different than single-pointedly making these prayers for a very long time. But then the question is, why shouldn't everyone pray to be born there? But it's understood that there are different ways people can develop. So for some beings, it might be more beneficial to be born in a situation like this, where we can experience suffering. Because in the Pure Land, there's no suffering. So it's harder to develop renunciation. And a general consensus is that actually one can't achieve enlightenment in the Sukhavati Pure Land because it's impossible to achieve a direct perception of emptiness, or the path of seeing. Because to do so requires very forceful renunciation. And that's not possible to generate in that circumstance. So that beings who are born there are only there for a particular period of time, as befits their karma. And they're born back into a human body or some other suitable realm where they can continue on the path. But for certain beings at certain times, this is beneficial. It's certainly better than being born in a place where you can't practice Dharma at all and you just keep creating negativity. So it depends. And I think somebody who feels drawn to that, maybe it's worth pursuing it. Maybe it has to do with that person's particular karma. Or the recommendation of a particular teacher. So like anything, there are different capacities of different beings, and some might be more, more inclined to that kind of thing, or might be more beneficial for them. So that's basically the answer to why, why it's presented differently for different people. Yes.
One who is on the Bodhisattva path.
Yes.
Motivation to be born in the Pure Land has to be for the Buddha.
Yes.
That sounded a little bit like some people just want to born in the Pure Land.
Well, that's the thing also. It depends on one's motivation, right? So the prayer, it's not just a matter of, may I be born there? It has to be done with the right motivation. Now, another thing, this is again, with Mahayana mythology, sometimes I don't know quite how to take it, but we have this question of what happens to Hinayana arhats when they die. Because at least to the view of many Theravadan countries, is that their consciousness snuffs out like a candle going out. And in Mahayana, that's, at least in Madhyamaka, actually, some Mahayana schools do accept that. But in Madhyamaka, and like in our school in Geluk, that's not accepted. But what happened? Where do they go? And there, it's also understood that they're born in the Pure Land. But that's kind of like in a very subtle state of existence, where they're in a Pure Land, but there's no conscious activity where they're actually developing. It's sort of like a long break. So the analogy, there's a way it's poetically described, that they're born in Sukhavati, because when you're born in Sukhavati, you're born in a lotus, and that lotus blossoms, and you receive teachings from Amitabha Buddha. So they're born in the lotus, but the lotus never opens. They just stay enclosed in the lotus for a long period of time. But of course, according to the Mahayana teachings, especially in Madhyamaka, then that doesn't last forever. Eventually, they're woken from that, and they see their benefit of entering into the Mahayana path. So that's one example of beings who are born in the Pure Land, even without the motivation to benefit others, just because their karma is so pure. They've abandoned all of samsara. There's no karma to be left to be born in samsara. So they're born in a non-samsaric experience, but kind of in a neutral way, without any ability to advance. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Question comes up a lot regarding the not doing out of compassion what is otherwise on virtue. Mm-hmm. How would you advise the one who takes Bodhisattva vows? It happens a lot with pets, humans even maybe, that dying and suffering.
Yeah.
Here in this culture.
Yeah. That's a very difficult question. Yeah, I mean, euthanasia, basically, right? I mean, the traditional Buddhist presentation is that one should not do that. It's said that for a number of reasons. One is that it's still killing. So as a monk, for example, if I do that, I lose my monastic vows. Even if it's a very minor thing, it's like this person is on the verge of dying, and I do something to just, finish it for them. For a monk, that's completely against their vows. So for one thing, it's creating negative karma for the person who does it. But then, of course, the question is it beneficial for that person? So as a bodhisattva, should I override my personal vow to help that person? And even then, in the Buddhist tradition, usually it's understood to not really be helpful for them, because it's said that unless you know where they're going to be reborn, so they already have the karma to be experiencing suffering, and it may be exhausting that by experiencing it now. Whereas if they die, they're just going to continue experiencing that suffering in a future lifetime. And to allow them to could go through that experience, now, of course, as much as possible to alleviate it. But generally, the Buddhist presentation is it's not helpful to them to end their life, especially if it's a human being. And especially if a human being, I mean, it's one thing if it's like they've lost all conscious activity. But even then, I mean, from what I've read about studies in recent years, there's a lot of evidence that people who appear to have no conscious activity actually do have a fair amount of activity going on. And so if they have that activity, that gives them the opportunity to transform their mind in some way, especially at the time of death. And somebody who's approaching death has the ability to reflect on their life and consider what they did right and wrong. And by taking that opportunity away from them, it actually, even if they don't see it as positive in themselves, it actually could be harmful to them in the long run. So generally speaking, the Buddhist position is that one shouldn't do that. But again, we have to use our own critical reasoning in everything. And what really is the best thing in this situation. The Buddhist view also is that you shouldn't commit suicide. But there are examples of monks and nuns and also lay people who have immolated themselves. And some of these, actually one of these persons I knew personally, and I think it was a mistake in this case, unfortunately. But there's some cases that I've read about, and one of the most famous ones was in Vietnam. It was Thich Quang Duc, I think is the name, I don't know how to pronounce it, who in 1963 immolated himself in public. And it's generally, most Vietnamese accounts I've read of it by other monks see it as a very positive bodhisattva activity. That he was sacrificing himself, and we can see from the video or of this that this was not an ordinary person, because there was no sign of pain in having done so. So there any rule, we have to look at really what is going on in the situation. So I can't say blanketly that there's no case where euthanasia is right thing to do. But as generally, it's important to consider that it could be a lot more subtle, that there are a lot of other factors to consider other than immediately, oh, this person looks like they're suffering, they'd probably be better off if they finished their life or with a pet. I just read an article recently by one person arguing against euthanizing pets, saying that, if we don't, when the argument was basically, when we buy the pet, we should be willing to take responsibility for paying for its medical care. If when the pet gets sick, we just then think, well, I can't afford this, I'm gonna kill it. No, it's like we wouldn't do that with our children, so why would we do that with our pets? That's another point to consider. If we're in the situation right now, we might not have a lot of choice, but to then consider that ahead of time when we're thinking of having a pet. What responsibility am I taking on? It's just not just a matter of having it for my own enjoyment, and when that no longer functions for me, then I can just get rid of it. You have to consider this as a sentient being, and what is the best course of action for them. Yeah. Yes.
Regarding Pure Land.
Yes.
Question. I don't know. Pure Land, they might not be. Oh. Seems like for the Mahayana path, go to Pure Land would not be beneficial and not like merit. No suffering practice on. If there's no suffering to practice on, then I would assume that Pure Land is not blissful then.
So I think you're saying that somebody requires suffering as kind of a motivator, first of all, to generate enthusiasm for the path, and also that bliss is only bliss in relation to suffering. So I think that there was the example that was given that somebody can achieve the path of seeing without being in a human body or a god. It says human or god, but meaning a desire realm, not a Pure Land. So there is an acknowledgement of that, but there's also an understanding that there are many different ways people can develop. So right now we might not have a lot of experience of that, but that doesn't mean that there could be a possibility of somebody making a lot of advancement on the spiritual path without necessarily having suffering. That they just gain understanding and they accumulate merit by being in the presence of this Buddha and receiving teachings and meditating. And furthermore, it's quite explicit that suffering, that ordinary happiness is only happiness in relation to suffering. So it's like going into a hot room when it's cold outside. It's not really happiness, it's just that you're not cold anymore, but eventually you're going to feel too hot. But the happiness of enlightenment is very different from that. It's not a kind of happiness that causes us to become attached to it. It's just a complete pacification of suffering and an experience of bliss that is kind of beyond anything we're capable of conceiving of. So that shouldn't be that one can't have the happiness without that. But then ultimately, because I thought you were going to say, you didn't say this, but maybe this was part of your question, is that the goal is to benefit others. Right. But the main goal of a bodhisattva is to achieve enlightenment. I mean, the main goal is to benefit others, but through achieving enlightenment. So that's really the best thing. If one can achieve enlightenment more quickly, that's better than being born in somewhere where you can benefit others in a limited way, but are hindered from achieving enlightenment, because the degree of benefit you'll be able to offer when you're enlightened is so much greater. So sometimes it's said that bodhisattvas can seem rather selfish. There's some acknowledgement of that. They shouldn't have the attitude of selfishness, but sometimes it actually requires shutting out a lot of other things that one could do in order to really focus on attaining the goal of enlightenment. It's only at very advanced levels that bodhisattvas really don't need to worry about that anymore, where they can actively engage in all kinds of things and still make a lot of advancement. At early levels, sometimes it's a choice. It's like, in this lifetime, is it more beneficial to just focus purely on personal meditation, or mainly on that, or to focus on being beneficial in the world? And that really depends perhaps on one's karma. It can be judged by a teacher or by one's own experience. But in terms of expedience, it's better to take the path if one has the opportunity that will lead to enlightenment more quickly. Yeah.
Another online question.
Okay.
About the third pratimoksha vow.
Oh, sure.
So how do we generate effort to keep the vows? For example, in the West, we're exposed to a lot of sexual content in magazines, movies, and even in personal relationships.
Yeah.
How should we strive not to break the vows in the midst of that adversity?
Yeah, that's very hard. I feel very happy. I can say, I'll just give an example for myself, that before I became a monk, I had a lot of questions about celibacy because it was something that was so foreign to my culture. There was a strong question of, is this unhealthy? That was one of my main worries. That's what most people think, that you're just repressing this desire for years and years, and it's going to adversely affect your body somehow. So I worried about that for quite a few years. I can say that since I've become a monk, it's never worried about it at all. It's been so much easier than I expected. But part of that is that I'm in a society where this is not so strongly emphasized. We don't see constant, displays of sexual innuendo on television or on billboards or whatever. And it's not in the Indian society in general, and also in Tibetan society, people don't dress in a way that's provocative to others. So it's not constantly in your face all the time. And there's not this underlying sense of this is what's good and you're successful if you achieve this. It's quite the opposite. Even though Indian people and people, of course, have sexual desire, and many of them transgress what's considered appropriate in their culture, it's considered inappropriate. It's not considered, oh, he's so great because he's achieved all these great things. So it's a very different attitude, and that's, for me, it's been very helpful to be in part of that. So I can imagine, continuing to be in a society where it's quite the opposite. Yeah, there's a lot of obstacles to that. And so, I can't give an easy answer, but a few things would be, first of all, to limit one's exposure to media. That's probably the most important thing. To limit your exposure to watching movies. I haven't watched a movie since I've been a monk, other than a few documentaries. And I feel really happy about that. I feel, some people say, well, you don't understand the world if you don't watch movies, but I think that's wrong. There's many other ways to understand the world than to watch movies. There's many other forms of media, and movies are generally, for example, Hollywood movies, it's created in a very specific context of a very small group of people who have a very narrow view of the world, in my opinion, compared to the experiences of a lot of other people. Not to say all movies are like that, of course, but there are many other ways to learn about the world. As I said, I spend a lot of time every day reading a lot of different books from all kinds of different disciplines and backgrounds. I find that much more helpful than just watching a movie, which is pretty much, most movies are made to generate attachment because they're made to sell. So limiting that and limiting exposure to music and so forth. Music has been one of the hardest for me because even 17 years after having listened to music, I still have songs in my head when I was a teenager. So that can be very, sort of pernicious in the mind. So limiting that to whatever extent is possible. Doesn't mean as a layperson you don't have the vow to avoid these things, and it's okay to listen to music as a layperson. There's no vow against it, but to judge for yourself the degree to which it is actually disturbing your mind, and maybe it would be more peaceful without it. So test that. And the second thing would be to occasionally spend time in a place where this is not infiltrating your mind all the time. So either within this country, going to meditative retreat, there are many places you can do this in a group, or just doing it personally, where you're not always exposed to this, and you experience some taste of the peace that can come with not being exposed to it. So it doesn't when you are exposed to it again, you have some sense of this, detachment from it. There's something better. Or also going to another country, coming to India and teaching for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which is in and of itself wonderful. But also then you experience a totally different world. And you can see that there are many different ways that people live their lives other than simply how it's lived in America or other Western cultures. So taking yourself out of that for some period of time. Either the retreat or just being with the community that's sort of more like-minded. And then, of course, there's the antidotes that are talked about in the teaching. So, we sometimes think that sexual desire is a purely biological thing. That's often how it's presented, that it's just a natural part of biology that we can't help. And in Buddhist philosophy, that's wrong. I mean, as I say, with anything, we should examine it. But the Buddhist view is pretty clear on it. The Buddhist view is that to think that desire comes purely from physical processes in the body is a wrong view. And it has related to those to some extent, but it mainly comes from ways of thinking about things, our way that we conceive of things. So, for example, I talked about this example of the car, this great new car. The way to counter my attachment to the car is to think about all the disadvantages that aren't appearing to my mind. When we're thinking about how wonderful this new car is, that's a kind of meditation. It's considered an inappropriate meditation in the sense that it's based on wrong conceptions. It's thinking more and more about all the wonderful qualities and how this is going to bring me happiness, which actually is not true. Whereas I can think about more correctly, first of all, as I said, this car will definitely in 20 years not be in the same shape that it is now. And all the dangers that can come in an automobile. And simply, even if I don't get in a crash, is it really that how much happiness just to be driving around and all the things that I'm obviously contributing to harming the environment? When I'm driving, I'm crushing many insects. We don't usually think about that. So applying the same manner of thinking to sexual attraction. So this is one of the antidotes. Is that when we're attracted to somebody, it's not just a physical process in the body. It has to do with a particular way of thinking, even though it might be happening at a pre-conscious level. We're thinking all these thoughts about how wonderful this person is. There could be thoughts of, if I brought her home to my family, they'd be so happy. And I can imagine them fitting in. And we come with this whole fantasy of our life together and how wonderful that's going to be. So that is fueling that. And we have to counter that with first of all, recognizing it. That requires some concentration and meditation. And then countering it with strongly thinking of the opposite. That look at all the harm that can come from this. Not just harm in hurting somebody, but look at what happens when people get in relationships and all the suffering that can result from that. As I said, for me as a monk many years, for me that at this point it's the easiest thing. I still feel physical attraction to people, of course, that's undeniable. But if I feel physical attraction to somebody, I just think, would I want to be married to this person, and what would my life be like? And that's very easy for me to then say, no, I don't. That's not the kind of life I want to live. But if that doesn't happen naturally, it's just a matter of thinking about it and looking at examples. Do we see people who get married and live happily ever after? That's the story we get told in the movies, but is it actually what happens in real life? And all the kinds of things that do happen, not just in the long term, but how busy your life becomes. Now look at my friends from college. I had other friends in college who were also interested in Buddhism. And I should say I talked to one of them recently, and I kind of asked him, I really respect what he's doing, actually. He's not certainly wasting his life, but I asked, is he still kind of interested in Buddhism? But he's gotten so involved in his career and his family that he really hasn't given it much thought in the last 20 years. So of course, it's very hard to maintain a sincere practice if you're very busy with other things. So it's to think about all these different counter things. It's not to say that marriage can't bring happiness to some extent. We shouldn't just be totally blanket and ignore that, but we have to analyze very closely. and see if the way it appears to our mind is actually the way it exists. And usually that's not the case. Usually with all kinds of things, we can exaggerate the qualities. And so we try to use analytical meditation to counter that. So really, to answer your question is a little bit long answer, but the immediate advice is to remove ourselves from the object, because sometimes it's so strong. If you don't remove yourself from the object, then it's very hard to engage in any kind of analytical meditation. But once you have that opportunity, then not just to just sit there and feel peaceful and then go back to it, but use the opportunity to analyze the situation and to analyze the way your mind is constructing a particular reality.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
May you have a long life.
Okay. Anything else? Well, it's been a long day today. You all enjoyed it. I feel quite relaxed here, sitting in this comfy chair. So, yeah, I mean, I gave advice about refuge and Bodhisattva vows. Some of you might already have these vows. Some of you might be thinking about taking them. So, these are, let's say, things we can commit to that allow us to structure our life in a particular way, really with the goal of spiritual practice, right? It's the goal. I didn't say this, but with the pratimoksha vow, even really the goal, the motivation for taking it should be liberation. It's not just about having a better life. And so we have to generate some confidence in that possibility, as we think about taking those vows. And as I hope made very clear today, that this is not a faith-based religion. These teachings are not meant to be taken just because this is what the Buddha said or my teacher said. It's something that really requires examining very closely. How things exist. As you asked about the mind, if this relates with what is the mind. If the mind is just a physical process, then enlightenment doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we have to examine and think, see if that really makes sense. If these viewpoints about the mind being a physical thing, if that's really true, or if reincarnation, if that's something that could really happen. And there's a lot of ways to examine that. It's not just about, as I said before, it's not a very hidden phenomenon. It had to be slightly hidden in the sense that it's accessible to reasoning. And so it's said in the Buddhist teachings, it's inappropriate to accept a slightly hidden phenomenon based on textual citation. It's something that has to be understood through reasoning. And in modern world, also evidence. There's a lot more evidence now available to us than there would have been in the past. And then to think about taking these vows as a way of structuring our spiritual path. A lot of us want to follow a spiritual path, but it's very useful to have a lot of guidelines, not just about what you do in your meditation, but about how you live your life outside of that. It's going to affect how successful your meditation is. Okay, I think that's good for now. And I hope all of you also have long lives and are able to practice well, use those lives very beneficially for yourself and for others. Practice these teachings. Okay.